Before Mary, there was a promise. Before there was Mary, there was silence. Before angels sang in Bethlehem, a man knelt alone in the wilderness, unseen, uncelebrated, but chosen. His name was Joachim, and though history barely remembers him, heaven never forgot. He was not a prophet, not a king, just a man whose pain became his prayer and whose faith unlocked a door through which salvation would one day walk. The world called him barren, but God called him essential. This is not just a story of a father. It's a story of divine patience, of holy assignment, and of a legacy that shaped eternity. Because before Mary ever said yes, Joachim said, "I will wait." Comment, "I'm ready to hear what heaven remembers," if you're listening. And don't forget to subscribe to Ancient Light, where the forgotten are remembered and the unseen are revealed. The curse of barrenness. Joachim was not a loud man. He did not seek honor in the streets or applause in the temple courts. His righteousness was quiet, woven into daily acts of devotion. He prayed when no one watched, gave when no one asked, believed when no one else still hoped. But even the holiest lives carry a shadow, and Joachim's shadow was childlessness. In ancient Israel, barrenness was not just heartbreak, it was humiliation. To have no child was to be considered cursed, unworthy, forgotten by God. People whispered behind his back. They said Anne must have sinned, that Joachim's sacrifices were empty gestures. And yet, every year, he brought offerings to the temple, silently pleading for a child no one believed would come. Joachim and Anne bore the weight of shame in a culture that saw legacy as divine favor. Their neighbors grew old, surrounded by children and grandchildren. But their home remained quiet. No lullabies, no laughter, only the echo of questions. Why them? Why us? Still, Joachim remained faithful, not because he saw the promise, but because he trusted the promiser. But then came the moment that broke him. The high priest, in full view of the congregation, refused his offering. "You have no child," the priest declared. "Your gift is unclean." The rejection wasn't just personal, it was public. His righteousness had been questioned by the very gatekeepers of worship. His offering was cast aside like he didn't belong. Joachim didn't protest. He didn't curse the priest or shout in anger. He turned and walked away, past the temple gates, past the walls of Jerusalem, past the eyes of those who no longer believed in him. He left not to run from God, but to find him. Sometimes faith doesn't stand tall. Sometimes it walks into silence. He journeyed into the wilderness, alone, carrying nothing but heartache and hope. No servants, no possessions, just a man and his unspoken prayer. He climbed the barren hills, settled among the rocks, and built a small altar. Stones stacked by trembling hands, fire lit by fading strength. It was here, in the emptiness, that Joachim chose surrender over bitterness. He fasted, he wept, he lifted his eyes toward heaven and asked questions without words. He wasn't just asking for a child anymore. He was asking to be seen, to know that his life still mattered, that the silence was not rejection, but preparation, that perhaps the delay was part of the design. Days passed, then weeks, no voice, no sign, just wind and sky and the ache of waiting. But Joachim stayed, because somewhere in the deepest parts of him, he knew that heaven doesn't forget the faithful. Even when men do, even when priests do, God still remembers those who wait in the wilderness. The wilderness prayer. The wilderness does not speak in words. It speaks in absence. No temple choirs, no voices of men, only the rustle of dry leaves and the cry of distant winds. But to Joachim, This silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. It stripped him of distraction, of dignity, of all but raw dependence on God. He had come to find something the world could not offer, a holy answer. Each morning, he rose with the sun, not to begin a new day of striving, but to offer what little strength he had left. He rebuilt the stones of his altar when wind scattered them. He lit fire from splinters. And he prayed, not with polished words, but with sighs too deep for language. His offering now wasn't a lamb, it was himself. Joachim's prayer in the wilderness wasn't desperate, it was surrendered. He no longer demanded a child. He no longer asked for vindication. He simply laid his soul bare before the Creator, saying, "If I am to be forgotten by men, let me at least be remembered by you." And sometimes, that's all true faith is, a quiet cry that only heaven hears. He remembered the stories of old, of Abraham, who waited decades for a child, of Hannah, who wept bitterly before the Lord. He thought of Job, who lost everything but never cursed God. Joachim's life was beginning to mirror theirs, not in triumph, but in trial, and that comparison didn't weaken him. It rooted him deeper. Nights in the wilderness were cold, but the fire on the altar kept him warm. He would fall asleep to the flicker of its flame, wondering if perhaps God watched it too. Sometimes, in dreams, he thought he heard whispers, echoes of a promise not yet spoken. He would wake, look up at the stars, and wonder if one of them had been lit just for him. Joachim didn't know how long he would stay. There was no timeline, no end date. He didn't set conditions. He didn't threaten to leave if no answer came. He waited, because waiting was the offering. Every day he remained, every tear he shed, every prayer he whispered into the barren wind was worship. One morning, after what felt like a lifetime, Joachim knelt longer than usual. The sun hadn't yet risen. The stars still held their places. And there, in the hush of the dawn, something changed. Not in the sky, but in him. A peace settled over his heart, not because he had received a sign, but because he no longer needed one. He had been refined, and that's when it happened. A light broke through the darkness, not like the sun rising, but like something outside time had pierced the veil. Joachim opened his eyes. A presence stood before him, radiant and unmoving. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a dream, it was an angel. And suddenly the silence of the wilderness wasn't empty anymore, it was full with glory. The angel's message. The figure stood motionless, bathed in light that had no earthly source. It wasn't fire, yet it burned. It wasn't sunlight, yet it illuminated the soul. Joachim fell to his knees, not out of fear, but awe. He didn't speak, because no words could rise in the presence of something so holy. The wilderness, once empty, now felt like a throne room. Joachim, the angel said, and even his name sounded different, like it was being spoken for the first time. The Lord has heard your cry. Your years of silence were not ignored. Your offering was not rejected. What men cast away, heaven has lifted up. The words didn't just comfort, they ignited something ancient within him. Your wife, Anne, shall conceive, the angel continued, and the child she bears will be no ordinary daughter. She will be set apart, consecrated to the Most High. Her womb will carry the fulfillment of every prophecy. Through her, salvation will be born, not only to your house, but to all nations. Joachim trembled, not from doubt, but from revelation. This was no answer to prayer. It was a divine invasion. The child they had longed for was not merely a gift, but a vessel, a holy conduit through which God would enter the world. He understood now why the wait had been so long. This kind of promise required holy ground. The angel reached forward and touched Joachim's forehead. Instantly, visions flooded his spirit. Flashes of temples, stars, a young woman clothed in light, a child cradled by angels, the sound of nations weeping and rejoicing. It was overwhelming, but not crushing. He saw just enough to know heaven's plan was in motion. Then, as quickly as he had come, the angel vanished. The light receded. The silence returned. But it was no longer empty. It was filled with promise. Joachim remained on his knees, tears streaming down his face, not of sorrow, but of sacred joy. God had not only seen him, God had chosen him. The run home. Joachim rose from the ground like a man reborn. His legs were weary, but his spirit surged with a strength he had never known. The wilderness no longer felt desolate. It felt consecrated. Every rock, every gust of wind now carried the weight of divine visitation. And there was only one thought burning in his mind. Anne must know. He didn't walk, he ran, through thorns, over hills, across dry valleys. The path was rough, but the promise made it light. Every step beat with prophecy. The angel's words echoed in his bones. She will bear a daughter. She will be consecrated. Salvation will come. The message wasn't just news, it was history turning. As he neared the edges of the city, familiar sounds returned. Distant carts, temple bells, the murmur of daily life. But to Joachim, everything had changed. The world felt brighter, like heaven had pulled back a veil. He wasn't just going home, he was returning as the bearer of heaven's decree. When Anne saw him from afar, she paused. Something in his stride had shifted. He looked older, yet lighter, like a man who had carried sorrow into the desert and brought back a flame. She stepped forward, heart pounding, and then, as their eyes met, neither needed to speak. They both already knew. For Anne, too, had seen a vision. While Joachim prayed in the wilderness, an angel had visited her as well. The same words, the same promise. They were no longer waiting alone. They were chosen together. When their hands met, it was more than a reunion. It was the joining of faith and fulfillment. In that moment, Joachim and Anne didn't just rejoice, they worshipped. Not because they finally got what they wanted, but because they had stepped into something far greater. Their child would not simply break a curse, she would break the silence between heaven and earth. And so, the man once cast out of the temple returned with fire in his eyes and glory on his shoulders. The world still didn't notice, but heaven did. The first piece of the divine puzzle had fallen into place. And soon, the girl who would carry God would be born, the child of promise. In time, Anne's womb began to swell, not just with life, but with divine fulfillment. The whispers that once condemned her now fell silent. No one could explain it, but those who had mocked her now stood back in awe. Something sacred was happening in their midst, and it was growing in her body day by day. Joachim watched with reverent wonder. Every movement, every breath Anne took was now touched with purpose. He no longer prayed for a child. He prayed for the strength to raise one who belonged first to heaven. He knew this daughter would not be like others. She would carry a calling too large for this world. When the child was born, the air in the room felt different, thicker, charged. Anne wept as she held the baby girl, whose skin was soft as silk and whose eyes seemed to shimmer with ancient light. Joachim, trembling, touched her forehead and whispered, "Mary," and the name felt like prophecy fulfilled. She didn't cry loudly like other newborns. Her breath was steady, peaceful, as though she already knew she was sent. From her earliest days, Mary's presence stilled chaos. Even as an infant, those who held her sensed something undefinable, like they were in the presence of a quiet flame that never burned but never faded. Joachim held her often, walking her through the garden, whispering psalms into her ears before she could understand them. He told her the stories of Israel, the promises of God, the coming Messiah. And though she was small, her gaze was fixed and calm, as though the truths had already been written into her spirit. They taught her not with force, but with reverence. She was not spoiled, but she was sacred. Every meal shared, every word spoken in their home carried an undertone of worship. Because they were not just parenting a child, they were preparing a vessel. Raising her became an act of daily obedience. When Mary turned 3, Joachim and Anne remembered their vow. They had promised to dedicate her to the Lord. And now it was time. With trembling hands and unshakable hearts, they brought her to the temple. She didn't resist. She walked up the steps without turning back, as if led by invisible hands. Joachim's eyes filled with tears, not of grief, but of awe. He realized then she had never truly belonged to them. She was heaven's answer to centuries of longing, and his role was not to keep her, but to release her, to raise her just enough to let her go. Because sometimes the holiest gift is surrender, the quiet exit. After Mary entered the temple, the house of Joachim grew still. Her laughter no longer danced through the halls. Her tiny footsteps no longer echoed on stone floors. And yet, there was peace. Because Joachim understood something most never grasp, that his purpose had never been possession, but preparation. He didn't ask for visions anymore. He didn't search the skies for signs. He simply woke each day with a quiet heart, thankful to have played even a silent role in heaven's unfolding plan. While the world chased legacy through loudness, Joachim found his in surrender. His name didn't need to be remembered. His obedience would be. As the years passed, he became a man of fewer words, but deeper presence. In the town square, people would greet him with quiet respect, not because of wealth or power, but because something in his eyes had changed. He carried a weightless authority, as if he had spoken with angels and was now at peace with fading away. He would sometimes visit the temple courts from a distance, never approaching Mary, never interfering. He didn't need to. Watching from afar, he saw her grow, graceful, radiant, wise beyond her years, and he knew she was exactly where she belonged. His heart did not ache for what was lost. It rejoiced in what was being fulfilled. In the evenings, Joachim would sit alone, looking at the stars, not to search, but to remember. Each one reminded him of the night he was chosen, the night silence turned into glory. And he smiled, knowing that the same God who visited him in the wilderness was now writing history through his daughter's womb. When his final days came, they were not marked by drama or farewell speeches. No crowds gathered. No monuments were built. He simply closed his eyes in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the echo of fulfilled prayers. And in that stillness, he passed from earth to eternity, unnoticed by men, but honored by angels. Joachim's exit was as holy as his mission, silent, faithful, complete. He had raised the mother of the Messiah, and then, like a candle whose purpose was to light another flame, he let his own fade. Not in failure, but in fulfillment. Because sometimes The greatest stories are told by those who choose not to stay in the spotlight. A message for you. You may never be named in Scripture, never see angels or dreams, but heaven still sees you, just like it saw Joachim, forgotten by men, but never forgotten by God. His silence was not weakness. His waiting was not wasted. He became the root of a revolution by staying faithful when no one else noticed. You don't need fame to be chosen. You don't need applause to carry purpose. Joachim didn't preach. He didn't perform miracles. He simply obeyed. And in that obedience, he raised a daughter whose yes would echo into eternity. His legacy wasn't loud, it was holy. And that kind of legacy still moves heaven. Maybe you feel buried. Maybe you're still waiting, still weeping, still wandering. But Joachim waited too. Alone, misunderstood, cast aside. And what he didn't know was that his wilderness became the womb of God's greatest plan. His delay was divine timing. His tears watered the roots of a future he'd never see. The world teaches us to fight for attention, but heaven watches the hidden. Joachim's greatest act wasn't what he built, but what he released. He let go of Mary because he trusted the God who gave her. That's what real surrender looks like. Not weakness, but strength wrapped in humility. So if you're walking a quiet path, if your faith feels unseen, know this: you're not forgotten. You are being formed, and you carry the same spirit that carried Joachim through the wilderness, the kind of faith that heaven uses to change history, one silent act of obedience at a time. Comment, I received the assignment, if your heart is stirring. And subscribe to Ancient Light, because we're not just retelling old stories, we're revealing eternal blueprints. And maybe the next one carries your name.